Well, for more, I spoke with Joseph Humire, Executive Director at the Center for a Secure Free Society. I began by asking him about Bolivia and the economic impact of getting more indigenous people into the middle class.
Well, I think there's two things to consider. One is where the benchmark was in the sense of where Evo Morales started his presidency, where Bolivia was in terms of its indigenous population. And the other is just to look at the trends in the region as a whole. On the first level, Bolivia is a majority indigenous nation, meaning that more than 50%, I think hovers around 60% of the population of the country belongs to different types of indigenous communities. And within those communities, they were largely marginalized from the formal economy. Now, there has been efforts to integrate them into the formal economy, but when you have such a large pool of indigenous population in your country, naturally some of that's going to work. The second is Latin America has been riding a commodity boom over the last decade or more. And the region in itself, particularly the regions that are, or the countries that are more resource rich, like Bolivia, that have a lot of minerals and other natural resources that can be popular for extraction and for commodities, commodity consuming countries, have ridden a wave of growth, and Bolivia is one of them.
Now, you mentioned the formal economy, and for indigenous people, they're obviously working for a lot of the time outside of that. So what does their economy look like?
Well, it's still largely, the indigenous community is still largely in the informal economy in Bolivia, just as it is in many other countries in Latin America. And a lot of the reason for that is because there's too many barriers of entry within the formal economies, meaning that the formal enterprise or the free enterprise within these countries have too much red tape, too much bureaucratic hurdles that have to be crossed in order to be able to enter certain markets. So what a lot of indigenous communities do is, since they have they have markets, and they have local markets, and they have services and goods that they could move within their communities, they just basically go around it. They don't necessarily participate, but they still offer these services to people in their markets, in their local communities, and it tends to work out better for them. The problem with that is the government doesn't necessarily get to participate in the process, so there's no tax revenue, there's no kind of oversight over those activities, but it does get service and goods to the consumers.
So with that different treatment when it comes to the sort of oversight that they see from governments, what does it mean in terms of having that special status as an indigenous population? What are some of the benefits that come with that?
Well, it's kind of a catch-22, because in one end, yes, it does provide you special access and privilege to maybe to aid and development programs that are sometimes catered from multilaterals or other countries that are geared to help these communities. But that also creates a dependency sometimes, and that dependency actually, over the long term, limits your innovation, your ability to be able to want to prosper and grow, because you start to get subsidized in the way your economy starts to function. I think indigenous communities where you see the most prosperous when you take them from one society, say they're in Bolivia, and they're largely in a regulated society or a society that has a lot of aid programs that make them dependent, and you move them to another society where those kind of shackles come off, you see them prosper very well. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is because they learn to be very adaptive and innovative to their markets, because they have to survive. And they learn to become to improvise within the market, so that they can create new types of techniques and products that otherwise aren't available.
Now, one of the issues that indigenous communities can face is discrimination. And in fact, the International Work Group for Indigenous Affairs found that indigenous people are more likely to be pushed into forced labor. What do you think are some of the factors that are increasing that risk?
Well, one of the biggest factors is, and I'll speak about Latin America in particular, is Latin America as a whole, being a developing region, there's still a bit of a oligarchic or classist society that hasn't been completely evolved into the 21st century. There's many, and depends on country to country, and actually within countries, particularly outside of the big cities and into the rural populations, there still hasn't been a breakdown of the class structure, so that the economies can actually reach all of society. So what you see in many of these cases, and you see they're working on old mercantilist type models that are just adapted in terms of the way things work in the economy in the globalized world. But that doesn't really take away the fact that indigenous people throughout history have been, since pre-colonial times, have been used as slave labor, forced labor, as you said. And so some of that's still in the perceptions and the minds of the people that rule these countries. And that needs to really break before they embrace the entire population and allow them to really make these economies grow.
For people who perhaps don't understand what sort of contributions having indigenous communities can have on the broader economy, what message would you like them to have?
I think the biggest message to any government that's really wants to embrace the indigenous community and bring them into the formal economy is to just take the shackles off regulation. Because if you try to overregulate these societies, they're not used to that kind of burdensome kind of red tape or bureaucracy in their society, and they can prosper. There's a lot of innovative entrepreneurship in all kinds of different ways that they're being able to function within the market that could be used to actually bolster the innovation within the country as a whole if you let them do that without so much regulation. I think that's often the time why you see them move into the informal economies because the formal economy is frankly just too difficult.